Let's try that again. Just make sure that everything is working correctly. I assume so. Yeah, seems good. Cool. So before my laptop decided to completely freeze, we were talking about methods. So the start method happens once at the beginning of the script, and the update one happens every single frame. So for our purposes, let's just delete this and go through everything step by step. Okay. So what we will do is create a text object which will immediately create a canvas that's attuned to it. Let me just zoom this in a bit. Okay, so we have this text, and what we established from the first tutorial is that we can manipulate this in a script. So what we need to do is create the first method that happens right at the start, which is our start method. So notice how this filled everything out automatically. So let's just delete that and write it out step by step. So a method, right? So let's just type in start method as a comment. So we know this executes once, and every single method has a syntax that you have to follow. So it begins with sort of how the data is represented, so known as encapsulation. So this is known as public, or it can be private, or it can be protected. And these are different scopes that we won't need to get into now. So all we will write is public, just for argument's sake. Now the next part is the return type. So in the lecture we mentioned void, which means it doesn't return anything, or we could return things like int, or float, or any other data type you can think of. But for now, the start method isn't going to return anything, it's just going to do its job. So we'll just call it void, and then we'll give it a name. So the name can be anything, apart from the one that we're using here, because this is a built-in thing with Unity. But usually, the name can be whatever you like, followed by input parameters. Since we don't have any inputs, we can leave it empty. Then you open and close curly braces to signify the start and the end of the method. Right, so now we've got that, let's go ahead and quickly recreate the first tutorial. So we need to use the UI library, and let's have a public text object, variable, sorry. Let's just call it my text, and then let's just create a string for that. Right, now we can, these are declared because they don't have any values. Now we can define the values in the start method, so let's call it myString equals hello, and then we can do myText dot text because we're accessing the text component of our text game object, right? We need to access this, so we can modify that, and that's going to equal my string. We could just as well hard code this, but it's good to get into the habit of knowing what each variable actually represents. Just making sure this is still on. Okay, good. Right. So now if we go save this, go back to Unity, and this will, compile and update. Now if we attach this method to, say, the canvas object, we can see that it needs to take a text as an argument. So if we drag this onto it, it's now associated. So when we hit play, the text will update on the screen. All well and good. Now let's create our own custom method based on what we learned. So first of all, we'll create another one that doesn't return anything. So let's call it, so we're going to write public again for argument's sake, and then we would write void because it won't return anything, and let's call this set text value. So it doesn't matter what you call it, but this makes the most sense to me because what this method is going to do is take a string and then as an input and then set that into the text itself. So we would open our input parameters and pass in one argument, so string text value, for example. Open and close our curly braces to signify the start and end of our method. And now what we're going to do is take, so if we delete this, and we take our text variable, my text, this one, and now we're going to access the text component of it. So this is similar to like the text box, right? And this is going to equal the value that we passed in to the method. So what does this value mean? Well, let's say our string variable is equal to hello, okay? And then we now call our setTextValue method by writing its name, and then we pass in the argument it expects. So because it's a string, it expects one string value. So this could be hard-coded like this, or we could pass in an actual variable. So in this case, we've got my string, so we pass this in. So what this does is it takes this initial variable, it then passes it into the method, creates a copy of this string called text value, and then we use this text value to update what the text says. So if we go back to our script here, our scene, yeah, we should probably save it. Let's just call this test scene. Okay, now if we hit play, what this does is update. Cool. Now that's very similar to what we did before. So we're thinking, you know, what's the point in this? You know, why are we doing this? Well, it can be used for all sorts of things, but to just give you a quick version of how this could be useful. So let's put this update method back in. Let's just make this public as well. So we know update doesn't return anything, but what it's doing is it's calling itself basically every single frame. So now what we could do is pass this method into the update method. So it's calling this every frame. Okay, and my string may not update here, but just to give you an idea of what we could do. Okay, if make sure it's all saved, we hit play. So at the moment it's got hello. If we modify this directly in the inspector, we can automatically update it on the screen. And that's because every frame we're calling this thing and passing in the public variable that we needed. So already you can see the capabilities of this. And the nice thing about this is that you can call it within this method rather than having to update it in the update method itself, because what you want to do is have this as a standalone instruction. You don't want to have all of your code within one huge method, otherwise you're going to try and do 100 different things, and maybe in one particular instance you're not going to actually need to do all of those things. Maybe you only want to update this text value, you know, if something has changed. So let's say this text, let's give this text meaning. So let's rename it to player HP. Okay, and let's give that player HP a default value of 100. So now if we hit play, it's got 100. Cool. Let's say, for example, we have an enemy that deals damage to the player. Okay. So let's have another method called public void deal damage. Okay. And what this does is, let's say it decreases the player's HP by 30 or something. Right. So what we can do is pass in a string variable, for example. So let's just call this value. And then we can have a local integer of this method called HP value. And we will effectively convert the string value into an integer. So this 100 as like alphanumeric will then just become a whole number. Okay, so now we have this 100 value to work with. Now what we're going to do is check if the how about we create another integer up here called temp value. Okay. Now we add an if statement and say if the value that we have now is different to the other value we had, then we need to update this, because the player has been damaged. We need to tell the thing that it's different. Cool. So now we need to figure out what this temp value is going to be. So let's say that the initial value of this is equal to the initial value of my string, which is the player HP. Okay, so it starts at 100. And now let's have the value let's have the temp value -1 every frame, let's say. Okay, now we pass in our string variable here. So this is happening every frame. So this starts at 100. Actually, let's start this at like 10,000. And now it's minusing 1 each time. Now we can take this in, which has its initial value, convert it into an integer, and if the value is different, then update it. So at the moment it's going to update all the time because we're constantly taking damage, right? And just to have a visual indication of this, actually let's give it a while first. Let's see what happens. So this will compile. Now if we hit play, so we're at 10,000. Okay. And in here, so temp value minus equals 1. And then we pass 10,000 into here. Yeah. And then if 10,000 doesn't equal 10,000, update. But then this is going to -1. So that should be updating. Let's print this value. So by the way, this print is a method that prints something. This toString is also a method that converts the integer you pass in into a string. So alright, okay, so we're going to print this and see what happens. Okay, so we can see here that we are losing a value 1 at a time. The only problem is when it's not updating on the screen itself. So we need to figure out why that is. So my string is 10,000. So my string starts at 10,000. Yeah. So this begins at so 10,000 as a number, then value minus equals 1, and call this, so this is 9,999, this is 10,000. Okay, convert 10,000, 10,000 doesn't equal this, and call this. Ah, I see. we're passing in the wrong parameter. We're just passing in the same thing every time. So what we need to do is pass in temp value like that. Right, now let's click it. Now we can see it's going down fairly quickly. This also looks like a rudimentary timer. Sort of like in milliseconds effectively. I wouldn't recommend doing that, but this is a way of updating the text on the screen through a method. Okay, so what we're doing here is we have a method for setting the text value via an input string. We are checking if the player has had any damage dealt to them by comparing the current value with like some temporary value, and if that's true, then do this. So in a game scenario, you wouldn't have this in the update method. You would have some sort of, code where the enemy would go through a procedure, or maybe you would press a button or something, and then the value would change, and then this would do this. Otherwise, a value wouldn't change at all. But this is a very sort of introductory example of how to pass strings with methods. I'll probably go over sort of return types in a different video, but this is mainly to get you used to separating your code into chunks. Because what we could do is put all of this in the update method. For example, if we did this and copy all of this, put this here, and then delete this. Okay, delete that as well. So now what we're doing is setting the temp value into here, and then we're passing this, converting that. Then we're doing this again. So you can see how putting it all in one method is sort of getting a bit messy. We're minusing 1 from this, then we're updating the text, and then we're converting something, then we're checking something, and then we're updating again. We've got this twice. So what we could do is have this one update in its own method, and then that way we're not repeating code, we only have one line of code dealing with this. So if we were to write this back in, we can have void update text, and as an input it would be string, doesn't matter what it's called, and then we do my text equals input string, like that. And then we can remove this line and simply put in the thing we needed. And we can do the same up here as well. Okay, so it calls a method called update text and then does this line. And this is better because not only is it easier to read, because you can add a comment here saying, method that updates text. You also have a lot more control on what you want to do. Rather than update it every time, you may choose to call this method every once in a while, with an if statement or something. And also, because you're not duplicating your code, you're not increasing the memory consumption of the project that you're working on. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, just let me know, send me an email or something. But hopefully this extra example gives you another opportunity to understand methods. So until next time.